back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kaligan. Dimitri, how are you?
I'm having a good day, Conrad, and we're pleased to have our guest today, Jim Jatras. I'm sure most of you have already familiarized yourselves with this esteemed gentleman of the Orthodox Americas. Conrad, I'll take it over to you to kind of introduce our new guest today.
Oh yeah, Jim Jatras, our first guest here on episode 4 of World War Now, the first guest. Jim is he's a DC based or DC area based at this point attorney. He worked at one point as a senior policy advisor to the GOP on foreign policy, as well as at one point being a diplomat to the Soviet Union, as well as serving in Mexico and just generally for a long storied career in the foreign service of the United States. Jim, it's great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Conrad. Dimitri, really proud to be here with you both.
We talked about a little bit before on the show how when we started this podcast, we knew basically even before we recorded the first episode that Jim's going to be our first guest. You know, we think that your analysis and your what your whether it's your writing on strategic culture or just even your Twitter page, you're coming at it from the same perspective as us. You know, this orthodox, this traditional, this postmodern perspective. So we're very excited to have you here today and to hear your analysis.
Well, thank you so much. Just very briefly, I did not actually was not a diplomat to the Soviet Union. I was in the diplomatic service and worked in Soviet affairs at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs at the State Department, and later in the Office of Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and then for many years at the U.S. Senate. Was not actually assigned to the Soviet Union during that time, although I've done a lot of work in Russia, Ukraine, and other points in that part of the world since the end of the Soviet period.
Apologies for the brief misunderstanding, but
Not
either
at
way, you've proven that you are, in
all.
fact, a subject matter expert of some degree when it comes to the US and the collective West relationship with the former Soviet Union.
Well, thank you. I like to think of my expertise such as it is. Oh, and by the way, as far as my being an attorney, I have let my bar memberships lapse at this point since technically I'm retired. I'm now simply a Virginia country gentleman. So
Okay.
hopefully that's a more honorable career than being an attorney of any sort. In any case, I like to think of my expertise such as it is as being more about America and American policy toward the rest of the world. I think a lot of times when we focus on things like the war in Ukraine, or for that matter, our attitude toward China, Taiwan, the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, when of course it first became apparent that the NATO Death Star had become fully operational. Um, I think I like to focus more on not so much knowing everything about everything else in every other corner of the world. You do need to try to understand those things as best as possible, but kind of a collective sense of know thyself. What motivates our leaders? How do they operate? How do they look at the rest of the world? What ideological agendas do they have? And I would say that is more of my formation in terms of where I'm looking through that lens of the rest of the world and trying to figure out why things are going so terribly wrong, which at the end of the day isn't really about Russia or Ukraine or China or India or Iran or any place else. It's about what kind of people we have running things in Washington right now. And that's where I think most of us, especially those of us who are Americans, or for that matter, people in the rest of the world who are affected by American behavior, really have to focus our concentration.
Yeah, and I think that's on that point, Jim. The people running the United States and its foreign policy at the moment seem to have a keen eye, at least on the Eastern European front. We see the Ukraine is essentially being funded not just by the United States separately, but by the entirety of NATO in terms of military equipment. Of course, you have first aid, financial resources, the essentially monetary bailouts on an unprecedented scale, and of course, this all has been exacerbated not just in the last 8 years, but in the last I suppose moving on to close to 8 months now, and I guess the view of this current event, as apocalyptic and cataclysmic as it may seem, I guess it would be interesting just to have your opinion as to um, did you see this event coming in February of 2022, Jim, personally?
Not in the way it unfolded. I expected. I think a lot of people thought in February that the Russians were just bluffing. Other people that I know were saying in specific terms, no, the Russians will invade Ukraine. And the fact that the CIA was saying that almost led me to think, well, I guess that's not going to happen because when have they been right about anything? I expected something big to happen. I did not think the Russians were bluffing. I read President Putin's statements, the Russian ultimatums to NATO and to the United States very closely, and it seemed to me that they had finally woken up and smelled the kvass, that they could not engage in this kind of clown show with the Western powers lying to them, making promises that they refused to keep, and then just brusquely disregarding their security concerns, that they would do something. I did not know what it was going to be, and I was somewhat surprised that it was as an attack on as broad a front as it was. Although, as it turned out then, I think many of us misread it at that time, that they were launching an attack on Ukraine of the kind of shock and awe style that we use when we attack another country like Serbia or Iraq or something like that. It turned out they weren't doing that, that they were fighting a much more limited war with the expectation, and in my opinion, a rather unrealistic expectation, that Kiev would sue for peace and that the Western world would fold its horns and accept the defeat. And I think now it's pretty clear that they are regrouping now for a much more substantial campaign that I think President Putin is sending very strong indications will have very serious consequences to the further existence of a Ukrainian state.
I think that gets to the meat of kind of the question here at the beginning when we're talking about the on the ground situation is one, do you Putin and Surovikin seem to have hinted for the first time in their public statements that the possibility of Ukraine perhaps not existing after this thing over is actually on the table now. And I've since the beginning of this said that even if Ukraine did exist, that I 100% see the Russians pushing towards Transnistria, and I even possibly see them giving up some of Western Ukraine to some of these Western countries. So I'm very curious as to what you think about what the map is going to look like at the end of all this, as well as what you think about like just the current martial law situation in Kherson in the south, and what you think, as you said, they're preparing for this more substantial campaign. What do you think that is going to look like in light of the past 8 months?
Well, as the great American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But I can't imagine a circumstance that the Russians would allow Kharkov and Odessa to remain in Ukraine. At the very least, I expect that to happen. Perhaps everything on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, up Chernigov, places like this, and then also, as I mentioned, over to Odessa, which would then connect them to Transnistria. What happens after that, I don't know. It would seem to me that they have to then install some sort of friendly government in Kiev. If there is to be a rump Ukraine at all, it would have to be one that essentially takes its cues from Moscow. That's going to be a tall order. I don't know how they accomplish that militarily. And in saying this, by the way, I don't rule out that the Russians could mess this up. They still could mess this up. Um, and when I say they, I mean primarily President Putin, have shown a very strong tendency always to want to reach an agreement with their quote Western partners, no matter how clear it becomes to them, at least it should become to them, that they have no partners in the West, and that no agreement is possible with Western powers that they can trust, the Russians can trust, will actually be kept. My biggest concern, and I'm saying this as an American, not as somebody who's looking at it through a Russian lens, my biggest concern is that at some point they may decide to cut a deal, if you will, take half a loaf, which limits how much of Ukraine will be either assumed to the Russian Federation or become some sort of new state, a Novorossiya or something like that, which I think is increasingly not likely, in exchange for promises from the Western powers, a kind of a Minsk III, if you will, which to my mind would be the biggest possible disaster for everybody. It virtually guarantees that in the very near future there will be another bigger war, one that cannot be contained. It seems to me that as many people who in goodwill are calling for negotiations, that any move toward a negotiated solution is probably going to be the worst possible outcome, that it is better for everybody for Russia to achieve its military goals, to dictate a settlement in Ukraine, force a humiliating defeat for NATO and for the European Union, which I do not identify, by the way, with my country, America, or American interests, and that some sort of a fundamental shift occurs in the global situation. I realize that's a tall order, but that's the only positive outcome I can see here. And one of the sad things, by the way, with the Russian go slow approach up till now, is I think it's actually resulted in far more dead Ukrainians than was necessary. That it's allowed this kind of a situation where the Russians try to limit their gains, limit their damage to Ukraine, but then that gives the opportunity for the West to pump all these weapons in, for the Zelensky regime to throw more and more men into the meat grinder, essentially for optics, for political headlines that they think may be beneficial to them or to their Western sponsors. I think that's resulted in tens of thousands of more dead Ukrainian soldiers than really has been necessary. But again, believe it or not, the Russian General Staff does not consult Field Marshal Jatras in laying out their plans. So I hope and trust they know what they're doing. But I do worry that the Russian tendency that I've noticed over the years to project normalcy on the minds and agenda of their Western so-called partners actually ill serves them. If they say to themselves, well, we know the Americans are just looking out for their interests, they're just interested in a little horse trading, they don't realize the kind of ideologues, fanatics they're dealing with over here in the woke West, that actually are not living in the same human and moral universe as I think the Russians are, and frankly, a lot of people in many countries, including here in the United States, that they need to look at it through that lens, and I'm not sure they're doing that.
Absolutely. I could probably compare this to, say, maybe the World War One era Russian Empire still having this idea that perhaps they could cooperate with the Republican and the slash liberal, United British Empire at the time, and of course the French Republic, in terms of actually having them as close allies. And perhaps they were close allies at the time, but there were these secret agendas behind the scenes to sort of dismantle the entirety of the Orthodox East at the time. But I mean, the Russian Empire, was in good faith trusting its allies, and it ended up, I suppose, ending in tragedy. But to the point of Putin and his colleagues, calling the Americans, the NATO, the European Union, people they speak to, partners. It's been this idea, this sort of state of disbelief that the Russian, I guess, political and military staff have been in since even the beginning of the conflict. We're just going to paraphrase maybe Alexander Dugin and Russian billionaire Konstantin Malafeyev, who was a huge sponsor of the entire Donbass region, especially in humanitarian aid. And the two of them basically mentioned on several occasions in the last month that with this recent, destruction of the Kerch Bridge, the terrorist attack that killed Daria Dugin, all of these events have escalated it to the point where Russia now has crossed the geopolitical Rubicon, and there is no going back. There was a time before February 2022, and there was a time after. And this idea that some Russian politicians in their statements continue to provide commentary that, well, look, these Western partners, we can come to some arrangements, we can come to agreements, we can maybe sue for, as you mentioned, a Minsk free. Like, no one has, I think, mentioned that yet verbally. Thank God for that. But they have it. But I think it's definitely on the cards. I'm sure there's a faction inside Russia and inside many of these, even Belarus, perhaps, that actually do want maybe a peaceful arrangement which can return commercial trade back to its back on its course and essentially sacrifice some of these great achievements. And I guess last thing regarding the Russian failures, I think there is still a very high chance that if Russia does fail this special military operation and some of the objectives it has set out in the Ukraine, that it does actually have a huge, fallback. There will be, there will be repercussions internally on the Russian domestic affairs. For example, not just on Putin, but I guess maybe this has something to do with them appointing Surovikin, this patriotic, very sort of established military general, as the figurehead of the special military operation in the first place. He maybe perhaps he is somewhat of a front man who can not just take the triumph, through the arc as Zhukov did in World War II, but also in case the special military operation does fail, he can also take the blame. Lord forbid, but I think that's definitely on the cards, and whoever did appoint him and provided him the media coverage in the first place probably had these two options on the table, because we're talking about very calculated, very sort of pragmatic people here.
Well, that all sounds right to me. And as I say, if it does fail, and the Russians are forced to settle for some kind of a false peace, false agreement, kind of a Brest-Litovsk, perhaps. I don't see. I don't. I think that would be a real global catastrophe because I think will only lead to a bigger war later on. Certainly with Russia and probably also then inevitably with China, and I just don't see how that serves anybody's interests. I don't know to what extent what we've seen in terms of the slow evolution of this operation was deliberate from the outset. When we heard that talk back in March, when the Kiev seemed to be prepared to sue for peace until Boris Johnson went there and read them the riot act. Were the Russians really at that time prepared to accept such an agreement? Because I think that would have been a huge mistake. To what extent have they really scoped this out? And we know that Putin, rather than being this, Vladimir Putler maniac that they make him out to be, is actually a very judicious manager among various factions in the Russian government. Some of which are very, very pro-Western, would love to be part of the Western woke establishment if they had half a chance, and hopefully that option is now foreclosed to them. At this point, though, I think one could also say that in terms of bringing public opinion along with them, you always want to be in a position where you don't have to drag the public's opinion along with you. You'd rather be pushed by it. And if the Kremlin is now in a position to say, look, people are demanding stronger action. We have to do something stronger to show that we're decisively winning this war, and that they feel they're being pushed along by public opinion. That's probably a good thing in terms of management of the war. Will it work out that way or not? What will they do operationally? I don't know. And then the other problem you have is that it seems that the Western powers, and we've been talking about the Kerch Bridge, and you mentioned the Dugin assassination and the and Nord Stream 2, and well, actually both Nord Streams, that these people are getting bolder and bolder in their provocations. The Russians are denouncing them as such, but they're not responding to them because they're walking a very fine line between what's going to win in Ukraine and also bring about the dissolution of the structures of the Western powers arrayed against Russia, but at the same time not put themselves in a position where a direct unlimited escalation occurs between Russia and NATO, which will only lead almost certainly to nuclear Armageddon.
That leads to there's all sorts of ways we can take some of this analysis. And I'm curious as to what you think about both the minds in Washington and maybe some of the factions there and their different goals, as well as both in Russia as well as with Russia's as a diplomat perspective, perhaps on the Russian diplomatic mission and how that is in many ways helping them in their operation. I'm curious, do you think that there is any faction in the U.S. foreign apparatus or just the government in general that is interested in having a boots on the ground, either US or perhaps NATO, UN pseudo kind of coalition force on the ground in Ukraine against the Russians? And as kind of another one I'd like you to answer, do you see like the growth of things like BRICS and the clear close alignment of Iran and even India and these other places with Russia, both kind of culturally from their people as well as in the strong neutral stance that their governments have taken? Do you see that as something that's only going to increase?
Well, first off, I think in terms of any kind of diplomacy or factions and within Washington, you can count that out. I know there's some smart guys out there. Like I like my two fellow Hellenes, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris, and a lot of their discussion. Mercouris in particular likes to say that, well, that we're going to see, we have an election coming up in America next month, and what if the Republicans take power in the House? that's going to make a big difference? Personally, I don't think so. That if you look at the majority of the Republicans in Congress, their only complaint about the Biden administration's policy is that it has been more militantly anti-Russian and given more support to Ukraine even faster, that they have not declared Russia to be a state sponsor of terrorism and that sort of thing. Yes, I expect there will be more, Trump-style mega Republican populists elected, win or lose the control of either chamber, but they will still be a distinct minority within the Republican caucus. I don't expect any kind of an initiative coming out of the Republicans to say, blow the whistle on this thing. Let's find some way out of this mess. So I think you can count diplomacy out. As far as the impact on the rest of the world, I think there's a lot of concern building in Washington that the rats are starting to leave the ship. I mean, I'm not calling them rats, but I'm saying a lot of the other powers around the world are watching which way the wind is blowing and saying, yeah, these guys don't look like winners. We better start making nice to the other camp. You mentioned India, of course. There are a lot of people in Washington. I worked for the Indian government as a lobbyist several years ago, and on questions having to do with civilian nuclear power. And a lot of the pro-Indian sentiment in Congress was based on a false expectation that the Indians were going to be some kind of a suicidal juggernaut against the Chinese on behalf of America. And of course, the Indians have whatever their problems with the Chinese, have no such intention. They are zealously watchful of their sovereignty and are not going to be anybody's cat's paw. And I think we see that increasingly with other countries that have been in the American camp for a very long time. Saudi Arabia, for example, the anchor of the petrodollar. Without the Saudis and the petrodollar, where does the whole so-called rules-based international order dictated from Washington, where does it stand? And that's why you have people in Congress now talking about sanctioning the Saudis. Turkey obviously is drifting toward the Eurasian camp. We can think of many other countries that see the wind blowing in that direction. So I think there's a degree of panic that is breaking out in Washington, but I don't think there are too many people, even relatively sane people like William Burns, the director of the CIA, the one who wrote the famous "Niet means Niet" memo back in, what was it, 2008 or something like that, regarding the inadvisability of further expanding NATO. As far as I can tell, even people like him are not having any kind of impact, or maybe are themselves going along with the madness that's gripped Washington and the Western powers that, like lemmings, are going over the cliff.
Oh no, I think the idea that we could have hope in Republicans outside of perhaps having a few more of them to go on TV to complain about what's going on is naive for people to expect that. And I mean, we're already seeing Republican leadership right now before the election comes trying to force 50 billion more dollars through of your tax dollars to Ukraine, which I want to get your thoughts on, as well as when it comes to factions in the government. I'm curious as well between even factions within the deep state who are both agreeing on how much, both agree to hate Russia and that they want to have endless pressure and eventually force regime change in the Kremlin, but perhaps disagree on how to do it. For example, I heard rumors that um, the State Department was even willing to establish a no-fly zone, but the Pentagon stepped in and was like, yeah, we're not doing that. And it's been the Pentagon at this point that has really been more enforcing the status quo of the American treatment with the Ukrainians. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is kind of funny because during the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, the Pentagon was more or less say muscular in their attitude toward the Soviet Union and their various client states, whereas the State Department tended to be more, we have to could be easy. We should be, be pushing more for the detente with the Soviet Union and so forth. I think there was a sense too among a lot of the, for want of a better term, liberal-minded people that, well, at least they're socialists. They're not, their ideology is not totally bad. These are people we can get along with. And then as soon as communism fell and something more patriotic and, dare I say, Christian began to materialize in Russia, they got very, very upset that they, in a sense, felt they had lost Russia, and that people I knew that were very, very, let's say, conciliatory toward the Soviet, excuse me, toward Moscow when it was run by communists, suddenly became ardently anti-Russian as soon as it wasn't communist anymore. So I think we have this kind of weird situation where the State Department is far less diplomatic in its attitude toward Russia than the Pentagon is, which at least one hopes that in the military you have people who know something about the nuts and bolts of, well, how people kill and get killed, and probably a little bit scared about pushing this thing a little too far. I do worry about people like Lloyd Austin and Milley and others who are essentially politicians in uniforms. But you hope that further down in the structure of the Pentagon, once you get down to colonel, lieutenant colonel, and the mid level and junior ranks of the military, there are people who are a little more sensible. Despite efforts to sort of woke up the military with all the stuff that they're doing with whether it's getting immunizations people don't want to get, or all the sexual stuff and other pathologies that they've imported. But I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question there?
Well, I was just kind of asking about the general uh factions within. I mean, the $50 billion of the
Oh,
Republicans.
yes,
They're
yes,
about to
yeah.
force that in, and
Well,
yeah,
let's
just your thought on the
remember
fact
too
that
when we
it's.
talk about
Go
yeah,
ahead. My
when we
bad.
talk about aid to Ukraine, of course, is that it's really not aiding anybody in Ukraine except to keep the war going and keep more of them killed. First off, it sounds like we're almost single-handedly financing the operations of the Ukrainian government and paying the bureaucrats, paying for the military, and so forth. But most of that money, as you know, is not really going to anybody in Ukraine at all. It's going to various weapons manufacturers to buy more equipment to replace the stuff we've shipped over to Ukraine for the Russians to destroy. But the money going to buy new equipment is not going to buy anything much new that will be available for months, and more likely in most cases years. So it's a great boondoggle for a lot of companies here in the United States and a lot of the executives in those big McMansions around the Washington Beltway. But other than that, it's really not going to do much for Ukraine at all. But it's funny money anyway. What do they care? Well, it's a burden on the taxpayers maybe, but it's that's how Washington operates, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, Ukraine's been the funny. I mean, anyone who's even read of even just basic Fox News coverage of the Hunter Biden situation knows Ukraine's the funny money, as well as not so funny money, human trafficking kind of situation, capital of the Western world at this point. And it's funny you talk about how the State Department and the Pentagon have kind of swapped places in their attitude. I think back in the day has a lot to do with a lot of Soviet Bergs and Steens being in the State Department at the time, and a few more Patton acolytes being in the Pentagon at the time. But when it comes to the Pentagon and stuff, I think I mean Dmitry can read it, but Milley had an interesting quote about the situation when it comes to the international rules based order.
Yeah, less than a couple days ago, essentially, the Chief of Staff of the United States, General Mark Milley, essentially says, and I'm quoting him, he just openly says, if Ukraine falls, the rule based international world order will fall. That was established 80 years after the end of World War II. So essentially, he's basically paraphrasing some of these geopolitical experts who've been writing in their textbooks that the world has become essentially unipolar. The global American empire in what all but in I guess all but in name has been a real thing, and it's essentially its dominance over the world has in a way will falter if this operation in Ukraine, if this, as Jim just pointed out, this absolute huge funding of economically just propping it up, if this commercial undertaking fails, then what kind of implications will this have on the I guess the New World Order that George Bush spoke about in the early 2000s? I think these are quite dire, at least for the NATO.
Well, yeah, and my only reaction to that is from Millie's lips to God's ears. I hope exactly that's what happens.
Mhm.
That because this is where we have to get to what is the connection exactly between the woke order in the United States and this global imperium that has been built up over the last few decades. Again, I'm older than you guys. When my naive expectation was when the first Cold War ended that somehow we could go back to a normal, non-ideological world of the sort that existed before 1914. It didn't occur to me until events began to unfold in the 1990s that that was not be the case because we were now going to be the great progressive ideological power, kind of a new Soviet Union, if you will, to impose our version of Gnosticism on the rest of the world. Instead of red Gnosticism, would be rainbow Gnosticism, and that I is the order that I hope does come crashing down. It always strikes me how many Americans, especially conservative ones, will be very critical of everything that's going wrong in our country, especially drag queen story hour and every abominable thing, mutilating children and all these things that are going on coming from our corporate and government masters trying to destroy what everything's good and decent in our country. But then they think that when the same corporate and government forces venture abroad, that it's all mom and apple pie and the America that they associate with everything that's good in the world, rather than being the very same monster that we're looking at home. And you see this, for example, when Patriarch Kirill said, well, it all comes down to it's not about agreements and treaties and security. It's all about are you going to have a pride parade or not? You have to have a pride parade, whether you want one or not. And that, unfortunately, is absolutely true. When you look at the way the American and the NATO and EU countries demand of all these countries that were formerly under communism, must adopt all these destructive woke values that have been built up for decades in the Western countries. That really is a litmus test. That there is, as I like to say, there's no transatlanticism without transgenderism, and that is the religion of the Western countries that we're now trying to fasten on Eastern Europe, including, close to my heart, to the Orthodox countries. And that's really, in a way, what this war is about. When that comes crashing down, as I think it will, I hope it will, I hope that provides a space for the reassertion of something like a normal, decent America to arise again, because I don't. I think there's a very close symbiosis between the woke imperium abroad and the woke regime here at home. And I hope the collapse of the one, as General Milley fears, and as I hope, will lead to the other one. It'll mean a very, very tough time for us here in America, which I think is unavoidable now, that America will go through something like happened in the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But I hope out of that ordeal, something like the historic American nation and a decent political and social order can be reasserted.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
I really like that you mention the 1914, that you hope the world can sort of return to a normalcy. And we talk about that on the show, that like returning to a world more akin to when the Anshan regime was in power, as opposed to the GAE as it is. The that's a time when states are
Yeah.
sovereign and all sorts of different expressions of government are going on, and there's none of this true kind of full spectrum dominance, imperialism that we get from the West. And in many ways, America only got to participate in that Anshan regime world for less than 100 years. I would say it kind of stopped for America after the Civil War. and and we also talk about on the show a lot how in 1918, we believe in 1917 was when that order really ended with the fall of the last true Christian emperor, Saint Tsar Nicholas II. And in many ways, that assassination, was perpetrated in many ways by Bolsheviks, funded, of course, by entities overseas from the Atlantic powers in the UK. Read Anthony Sutton and some of these other scholars. But you talk about how there's no trans Atlanticism without transgenderism. Even in our time, we saw old Christian empires, kingdoms, for lack of a better word, to call Serbia that, bombed by NATO, these kinds of things. In many ways, when the USSR fell apart, it was an attempted rape of like the riches of the Russian land and society. We still see CIA directors posting these bizarre maps of Russia broken up into 7 tiny little client states. So, Jim, with your experience, working in the U.S. diplomatic, office of the Soviet Union, and I know you have a lot of experience and knowledge of the old world and Orthodoxy, whether it be in the Balkans or even in the Holy Land. What's your perspective on the globalist empire there, and what it might look like if we return to something a bit more real?
Well, there's no perfection in human affairs. I mean, even when you have, let's say, an Orthodox monarchy, you get good kings, you get bad kings. There's sin and vice everywhere. There's corruption everywhere. You hope to minimize it, but you have to, life is, I guess, symbolized by golf. You play the ball where it lies. You take the bad with the good, and you try to do the best you can, because none of us is omniscient, none of us is sinless, none of us is perfect. If we look at the long peace, for example, from the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars until the Guns of August of 1914, there was relative stability in the European political scene. Yeah, sure, you had the Crimean War, you had the Franco-Prussian War, but you did not have a general war of the sort that we'd seen in during the Napoleonic era or during the 30 Years' War and so forth. Maybe that's the best you can hope for, where you have a kind of a concert of powers, where one power, as it turned out, it was of course was the British Empire, was the first among equals, but they also respected that other powers like the Russians and the French and the Germans and the Spaniards also had legitimate interests. And there was an effort to sort of stay on your side of the line. Yeah, there's some kicking and competition, but they also were not going to go too far just out of self-interest. That's what you would expect in any kind of decent multipolar political system. And I think that that's the invitation that beckoned to the United States coming out of the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We very easily could have taken our place as the first among equals among a multipolar set of powers, against the Russians, the Chinese, and so forth, maybe some kind of a European entity. We didn't want to do that. Instead, we opted for a benevolent global hegemony, in the words of William Crystal and Robert Kagan in their famous 1996 article in Foreign Affairs. Kagan, by the way, being the husband of Victoria Nuland. And we went down that road, unfortunately. Now, I think until very recently, maybe until February 24th, 2022, we still had the opportunity to step into that role. I don't think we have that opportunity anymore. I think we have passed the Rubicon, where now the only thing can be done with the GAE, the Global American Empire, is that it does have to collapse. If it does, I think there will still be a very strong America. I hope that comes out of that. There will be some sort of a concert of the powers. We might even somehow still end up as the first among those powers. I don't know how likely that is. Probably isn't anymore. But I think that's what we need to hope for in coming back to something like a normal world. Does that allow some kind of a genuine human values to reassert themselves, and hopefully in Christian countries for Christianity, and again more specifically in Orthodox countries for Orthodoxy, to be the guiding ethos in not only the affairs of the church narrowly defined, but also in society as a whole, where the ethos of society takes on a godly aspect because the rulers in that society feel that they are receiving their power from on high and need to try to implement that as best as their consciences and their power allows them to do.
And I think the other important thing you mentioned, Jim, is that essentially in that second half of the 19th century, when Europe did know, basically a state of certain peace, there was this understanding that Orthodox Christianity could be spread to other parts of Europe, and we see missionary efforts in Africa, in the Middle East, the Russian Church in Assyria. In America, you have Russian immigration, essentially, the Russian Empire setting up these dioceses, and this is basically what later turned into the OCA, right? So we see Orthodoxy spreading during a time of peace, and of course, the powers of the world sort of constricting it during times of war, which is really unfortunate. I think that trend, and we're seeing it now, we're in war plus the schism between, say, some of the Greek bishoprics and the Russian Patriarchate have really kind of suspended missionary efforts, even among, say, the Unions in the Ukraine. It's really concerning, I'd say. Like, it's a real cause and effect, I think. War and the suspension of, say, missionary and proper Christian proselytization.
Yes, I think that's right. But again, I'm not sure we should be too surprised at that. I mean, one of the things you do find in the church, because the church really can't be separated from society, is that look, if we honor our father and our mother, we also honor our country. And as we know, even in the past, Orthodox countries have gone to war against each other. The Greeks and the Serbs and the Bulgarians in the Balkan Wars. And you would expect the church to say, well, we support our country, we support our king, we support our government. I think a lot of times when inevitably in this world conflicts occur, we have this tendency to want to sit up on, to mix my pagan metaphors here, sit up on Mount Olympus and judge the actions of all the rest of humanity and say who's really behaving in a godly fashion, who is not, rather than understanding that those judgments are usually subjective. How do I stand by my country, my people? And of course, the church does the same thing. Um, I don't worry about that too much. I sort of feel that, well, okay, as long as people are honestly trying to do what they think that they're not only their civic concerns but their spiritual concerns are the responsibilities placed on them, then you have to leave it to people's conscience and let them do what they need to do. At the end of the day, hopefully they'll sort themselves out and we'll be brothers again. Now I do worry about when we talk about things like what's going on in Constantinople, or one hesitates even to mention that some of the abominations coming out of the head of the Greek archdiocese, Archbishop Elpidophoros, or Elpidoktonos, the hoop slayer, as he's known among many Greeks. Yeah, those things do worry me, because then you're looking at people going down the road that has destroyed the Protestant denominations and is destroying the Roman Catholic Church, and then trying to import that into the Orthodox Church through these various, so-called academic voices like the Fortumites and the Huffington Center and the Wheel and Orthodoxy and Dialogue, all of these things. You expect these kind of alien influences to try to come into the church. The wheat and the tares always grow together, but at some point you expect that these things will evaporate the way other corruptions have in the past. So there no. I guess in my personal opinion, which is very, very fallible, there are no easy answer to these things. We just have to sort of work our way through them and trust that God is guiding us.
Absolutely, and I think these liberal specters within Orthodox communities, especially abroad in the Americas and some of the English-speaking countries, uh, I think we can see the fruit. The fruits don't fall far from the tree in terms of you can see essentially who they support, essentially politically, geopolitically. Of course, Elpidophoros' support for Joe Biden, his positive statements towards Zelensky, things of that nature, regardless of the policies and the actual realpolitik that these politicians embody. Essentially this essentially you can see the views of you can see somebody's character by viewing his friends or the people he associates with, and some of these Fordhamite characters and these really questionable folks, I think they're essentially a product of the fallen, I guess, GAE essentially. I don't think they will have much ground to stand on if, say, the whole thing comes crashing down and a new sort of peaceful order is reestablished at the end of the day. So I'm quite hopeful in that regard, regardless of some of the negativities coming out, especially on social media. It's really scandalous sometimes.
You raise a very good point there. With regard to Constantinople, I think it's pretty well established that since 1948, when Patriarch Maximus was deposed and replaced by Athenagoras, that there's been a very close U.S. government uh, influence, if not control, over the ecumenical patriarchate, which let's be clear. I mean, there has no native flock to speak of anymore. It's essentially it's a what the English used to call a rotten borough in the parliament. There's a bunch of bishops with no people to speak of except in the diaspora. And that's why you get these extravagant claims of a primus sine paribus, of kind of a neo-papal claims coming from Constantinople, which are even more absurd than the ones coming from Rome. At least there's a Petrine explanation for the papacy. I don't think it's a very good explanation, but at least it's something. I have no idea on what Constantinople claims to base these claims. And then, as you point out too, for example, like the schism in Ukraine and the creation of this phony church there. Well, if the current Ukrainian state is replaced by something else, I guess there's not much of a future for that church, since it's solely a creation of the authorities in Kiev and their foreign sponsors.
No, it's so true, Jim, and we love having you on because you can really you can really mesh, what's going on in the geopolitical world, whether it's in the US or in the old world, with, this knowledge, the historical knowledge of what's going on within the church and understanding ecclesiology and these sorts of things that we want to still present to an audience that in many ways is still somewhat non-Orthodox, and to help them then understand what's really going on in these countries that the US likes to mess around in. But when it comes to these bishops and stuff with the Greek archdiocese and the Greek church, with the Greek church, we get the worst of the worst with Elpidophoros and whoever it was, the bishop of Italy, who submits to the Pope and says the Pope is his bishop. But on the other hand, in the Greek-speaking world, we get Metropolitan Neophytoses, we get
Yes.
Metropolitan Nectarioses, and these people. And you can ask me to repeat myself if this is a long two-tiered question, Jim, but you had the joy of, before it was released publicly, seeing Metropolitan Neophytos, or hearing him speak in a pre-recorded talk at the Uncut Mountain Press conference at the Antiochian Village. And he is someone that we very much revere and look up to on this show, and listen to and follow his words closely. And we've mentioned before on the show that he mentioned, especially when it comes to corrupt hierarchs, he mentions that St. Porphyrios told him that once he passes his 50th year of life, you'd begin to see a new crew of the ship, as it were, coming to take the place of the hierarchs, to sort of right the ship in times of turmoil. And we also saw Metropolitan Neophytos accurately talk about COVID lockdowns and what would go on. And he also more recently said, and this is kind of one of the reasons we even started the podcast and gave it the title we did, he said, we're in the second year of the Third World War. And I think that, Jim, you've said almost as much yourself, that as of now it's not a hot Third World War. It has a hot zone in Ukraine and a few other places, but then it's this economic, cultural, global war. So in light of the sort of the ecclesial angle, and for better or for worse, the preeminence of the Orthodox Church and Christ's Church at the center of reality in relation then to global affairs, what is your what do you kind of see happening there? Not that you have a prediction, but what's your kind of perspective on how that kind of plays out in our current dynamic?
Well, I hope the Metropolitan is right, and I was very pleased to see that presentation at the conference. I was also able to say a few words there in introduction to Dr. Jim Davis, the author of the new book about Antichrist that was published by Uncut Mountain Press. Is really an excellent book, and I was honored to write the epilogue for that book as well. Mostly updating with regard to the little health issue that went on for the last few years, and how much that revealed about the growing Gnostic tendency in our world. And I do hope the Metropolitan is right that this that what we're seeing now, sort of you might say the guns of August, but not so much guns, but sort of the economic collapse of the winter of 2022 and 2023. That something better can come out of this, and I hope it's not, when he still talks about a new crew, I hope it's not just within the church as an institution, as we were chatting a little bit about before the show, that if we're looking at a healthy Christian society, especially an Orthodox one, but you really had, sort of until in the pre-modern era, even to a great extent in Roman Catholic and Protestant countries, the notion that the church and the state should be working together for the good of all the people, and that the state authorities, no less than the church, should understand that their power comes from Christ, their authority comes from Christ, and they need to be Christ-like in how they conduct their affairs. I I hope there's a possibility that will be revived in our world as well. That when we talk about the place of the church, or godly values in the world, we tend to focus so much on the church as an institution. Everybody becomes Orthodox, needs to grow a beard and become a priest. Um, that's not necessarily true. We need people in the civic sphere as well that are no less dedicated to Christ's truth and exercise their responsibilities accordingly. That we need a Christian imperium, or a civic or secular arm, as well as one that's narrowly ecclesiastical. And like I was saying earlier, you still need to have a Dmitry Donskoy for Saint Sergei Radonezhky to give his blessing to. The priest, the saint on his own cannot do what needs to be done. by people in the civic realm. And that, not only means statesmen, it means executive authorities, judges, legislators. It also means people in our everyday lives, fathers and mothers, people in worldly affairs need to be conscious of this as well, in my opinion. And I think we've sort of lost sight of that. We have this almost docetic view of society where, oh, all that churchy stuff, when we go to church and say our prayers and do the fast, that's all Orthodox, that's all Christian. But when we go out into the world to, whether we go into the voting booth or whether we go into the general staff or the diplomatic service, oh, none of that applies. We're just supposed to obey the laws of the world that has nothing to do with God, nothing to do with Christ. I think that kind of division is very, very dangerous.
No, I completely agree. And in many ways, I think it's part of why people like our show so much. We've gotten such a strong response, but it's also, of course, our number one source of criticism. People say, you listen to an old man with a beard who thinks he can tell the future when it comes to politics. And of course, that's a gross caricature that is almost insulting. But in a way, I almost just want to respond, yeah, I do. And I trust it a whole lot more than I should trust Francis Fukuyama or someone at the World Economic Forum to tell me what they think will or won't happen in the world. But in that same realm, Jim, you talked about, we talked about the Ecumenical Patriarch, which is in Turkey, and we hear these talks. I personally have talked before. I do believe that Erdogan is going to lose the election in 2023 in many ways because Metropolitan Neophytos does talk about Turkey ultimately siding with the West in this kind of growing conflict we have today. And I also want to I want to relate that same idea because even saints like Elder Joseph, well, future saints like Elder Joseph of Atopide and others like even Saint Elder Gabriel, children of Saint Paisios, they've talked about the Chinese coming in and having something to do with this. And you talked about in your talk to the Ron Paul Institute that while we might get a fair multipolar world order, there is also a looming specter of perhaps a Saruman to the to the Sauron that is the global American empire in something like China. So I want to get your perspective both on the place of as the world retraditionalizes and re-enchantment emerges, the place of the words of these holy elders, as well as your perspective on something like something going wrong with the new world order.
Well, that's right. I mean, as much as I hope that the fall of you might say the globalist Sauron, whose business arm is NATO, may lead to a better multipolar world where national and religious cultures at least can flower within their own borders. And that may even lead to the revival of a healthy America. There's really no way to know for sure. I mean, as I mentioned earlier with regard to the Russian government, it's not like everybody in the Russian government is a pious Orthodox Christian. I think it's a very positive sign that at least the ones who are not at least pretend to be, because that's what people want to see in public affairs. Even if they're frauds in some cases, the fact that they have to pretend to be something holy is at least a good sign to me, rather than parading their depravity like happens in Western countries. And then you look at a country like China, of course, which is not a Christian country, where you do see very severe lockdowns. You see huge social control mechanisms and facial recognition and all of these things that look very much like a Chinese version of what we see the woke authorities in the Western world trying to impose on us with a kind of a form of what they call soft totalitarianism. Now, maybe there's a difference there. The unlike in the Western countries where the authorities seem to be going out of their way to destroy the historic national and religious identities of various countries, not just America, but England and France and Germany and so forth, where the Chinese form of soft totalitarianism, maybe bordering on hard totalitarianism, at least seeks to exalt the horn of the Han, to raise up the nation rather than to suppress it. That doesn't mean that something very, very bad can't come out of it because it is not informed by spiritual values. I hope something better can come out of Russia, but I think just the mere fact that the globalist Sauron championed by Washington may come crashing down doesn't mean we're out of the woods. That something as evil or even more evil may arise somewhere else. I hope that's not the case. But again, it's again something we have to be vigilant about and discerning about, because there are no promises in worldly affairs. Trust not in princes.
No, absolutely. And I think it's not just the princes of the world who are emerging, to the forefront. It's also the, I guess you can say, neo-pagan druids and the high priests of new religions, not just the religion of the rainbow flag we see in Western countries in the European Union, but also in countries like the Ukraine, where we have a symbiosis of not just the schismatic Orthodox, which notice how these schismatic folks have kind of taken a back seat. Zelensky doesn't even speak about them. He's adhering to a higher religion in his mind, this religion of the woke leftism. I think the era, and I'm sure, Jim, you being a professional, having made a career in the 20th century prior to the 21st, you would have some understanding of, I guess, the 20th century was in many ways an era where atheism triumphed and skepticism, rationalism, this pragmatic materialism became dominant. But in the 21st century, I think we're seeing a re-emergence of some sort of, at least this return, as Conrad said, a return to enchantment, a return to, which in many ways could, of course, benefit Orthodoxy, but also it brings about this somewhat of a semi-eschatological era in which, of course, probably at the end of it, the Antichrist will come to power, and he will be, of course, not an atheist. He'll be an actual religious leader. And we've seen, I think, in Ukraine, I mentioned in one of my tweets that in the War of 1812, I'm going a bit off tangent, but in 1812, Napoleon was declared by the Russian Orthodox Church Synod officially as an Antichrist, just like a proto-figure of the Antichrist when he was marching on Russia to take it down. So the church understood Napoleon as this bringer of this new identity, this liberalism, Freemasonry, republicanism, this Christian worldview, and they officially pronounced him that. And what we see today in figures such as Zelensky, and maybe less so in somebody like a geriatric Joe Biden, that they do bring this other sort of religion to the forefront. It's not atheism that they bring. It's not. We're not saying a Brezhnev or a Khrushchev type, agnosticism where it's just believe in the material, don't be superstitious. No, superstition is back on the table, and I want to see, perhaps, I'm not sure what the countries of Asia have to say on this account, because these countries are about as mystical as they can get, even despite, the 60 years of forced atheism. I think the world is definitely changing, and there's something that has to be said to about, essentially I'm paraphrasing Conrad, but the re-enchantment of the world is definitely ongoing, and I don't think many people expect where this may go in the end.
Oh, that's an excellent point. I mean, by the way, I'd be interested to know if the Russian Synod, since there are no articles in Slavonic languages other than arguably Bulgarian, whether they called him the Antichrist or an Antichrist, because as we know, there have always been many Antichrists ever since the Apostle John wrote that. But the question is when the Antichrist comes along, which we'll find out when he comes. I think this was something that was central to Dr. Davis's book about the growth of Gnosticism over the centuries, and in some ways, I don't know that it would make that much of a distinction between, let's say, classic Marxist-Leninist style atheism and the re-spiritualization of the world as we're seeing now in various Gnostic identities. Because after all, even that kind of um, that kind of atheism that pretends to be scientific is really religious in its own way. It's a profoundly spiritual way of looking at the world, at the kind of a divinization of matter, in a sense, which in some ways is a kind of a paradox, because Gnosticism in its classic form denies the goodness of matter, that matter is created by the evil God as opposed to the good spiritual God. But I think what we're seeing now is, in a way, a kind of another turn of the wheel, where that kind of red Gnosticism has been supplanted by something closer to the initial Gnostic vision, which is everywhere now, and I think is even endemic in things like, what's the overlap between the Gnostic priests of Cybele castrating themselves in the ancient world and our modern world, where we want to castrate all the little children to turn them into the other sex? It's amazing how similar some of these things are in their themes, where people are seduced by this kind of madness that really drives a wedge between the spiritual and the material side of what makes a human being an integrated person. So yeah, I think all those things are growing in our world. The fact that you're right, though, that this kind of re-divinization or re-spiritualization of the world on the one hand can lead to all sorts of crazy superstitions, as we're seeing. At the same time, maybe open some hearts open to the voice of the Holy Spirit, where they come to the truth, to the knowledge of the truth, because they've reached the dead end on everything else. And as you know, with many people, they have to go through every possible spiritual fraud there is before they finally get to the truth.
No, no, it's very true. And I mean, Elder Ephraim, he said, or even St. Paisios and St. Joseph the Hesychast had talked to him about, go to America someday, even America will be holy, and he built monasteries and almost we talk about this old world way and this return of the old world. And I know you can never truly return to something that has passed, but rather the reemergence of something that resembles the old world in its reality. And there's no more this worship of democracy. There's no more this veneer that everyone has to pretend to believe in egalitarianism. It's back to the real world. It's about the faith. It's back to family. It's back to ethnos. It's back to these sorts of things that can allow for infinite, interesting civilizational technology to be experimented with and tried around the world. And I think in many ways, we've already talked about 1914, 1918, these kind of turning points in the modern world. I think in many ways, we didn't just experience the end of the Constantinian lineage from Constantine's establishment of the Christian Empire through the Byzantine Empire, through the Russian Empire, through to the assassination of the Tsar. We also saw like a fundamental, like an alchemical, I consider it what you would call an alchemical transmutation of like the collective unconscious or like the world mind. Like people, with the end of like the Ancien regime, people were ushered into this fake world of industry and where technology reigned supreme after it sacrificed millions of Europe's young men on the altar of what turns out to have basically been multicultural democracy. And since then, people have it's been evolution. It's been all these things that we are kind of seeing fade away as spiritualism returns. But that was what it's returning, because in many ways, like how Christianity is returning to Russia, in many ways, the enchanted world is returning from this fake world that got ushered in after the First World War, after that, what you could almost describe as a ritual.
That's exactly right, and that's why, to tell the truth, I'm not entirely pessimistic about prospects for America. I mean, even though I'm of Greek origin by blood, all four of my grandparents were from Sparta, but my parents were both born in the United States. I'm not really a Greek in America. I'm an American of Greek origin. I've been genetically here for 100 years, right? And I don't speak Greek. English is my only native language. And when I look back on American history, yes, I know this is not an Orthodox country, but I don't look at Grant and Robert E. Lee and George Washington, people like this, as aliens. These are my forebears in a civic sense, if not a blood sense. And I want to cultivate and revive what is best in this country. And nowadays they like to shove down our throats the notion that, oh, the founding fathers were all a bunch of deists and Enlightenment men. Okay, yeah, it was the Enlightenment, and some of them were deists, but most of them were pretty decent Protestants according to their lights, according to their understanding of Christianity. I think even our founding fathers would have been appalled at the notion that they were creating a democracy of all things. They certainly did not want that. They knew their classical history about what happens to democracies. When I think of the history of not only America but also of the Englishmen who founded this country, going back through the history of that country, back to Anglo-Saxon England, which I understand to as an Orthodox country, that there is a pedigree, a history, even leading to America, that ultimately gets back to the same values that I think we are hoping to cultivate as Orthodox Christians, and to try to revive those, to separate the wheat from the chaff and the wheat from the tares, and to build something healthy upon the roots that are not that are there. They're there. Maybe they're deep, but they are there. And I think that's something we need to try to focus on, because when we talk about the growth of a re-Christianization of America, or the growth of a more Orthodoxy in America, we're not going to build a little bit of Russia here, a little bit of Greece, or anything like that. I think we're past that era. When I go to my local parish here in Stafford County, 80% of the people there are ethnic Americans. The other 20% is, sort of even numbers of people of Greek or Russian origin, or some Serbs or some Romanians, but they're mostly Americans who are looking for the truth. And overwhelmingly, they're patriots. They're people who love this country, love the history of this country, and want what is best for this country, but in an American way, not a Greek way, not a Russian way.
No, I may be at this point slowly lurching more into Texas nationalism than American nationalism, but that's because that's because I live in Texas. And even though I was unfortunately born in Arlington, Virginia, I had a cup of Texas soil underneath that hospital bed. So by golly, I'll die for this. I'll die for this at once independent republic. But you're right when it comes to America. I mean, even our capital, despite however many horrible, godless, Masonic, evil decisions have been made there's still a relief of Justinian the Great. He's still like our law still traces its origin back to one of the greatest Orthodox law-giving saints. So there's no reason to necessarily become overtly anti-American just because you might recognize the truth of the current occupation. But I think Dimitri had something to say next, so I'm going to toss it to him.
Yeah, I think for those despairing and thinking that the world is coming to an end, the West is falling, and I don't think that is the right approach. I think one always needs to be hopeful and faithful and trust in God, trust in prayer. There isn't. There's always room for miracles to occur. Let's not completely exclude God from the world. We already spoke about the disenchantment and atheism of the 20th century. Let's not return to that. But frankly, I think there are some great examples throughout history of Orthodox communities, either from the ground up or from the upper echelons of society, converting to Christianity, essentially, or at least portions of those nations. Like in the Georgian sense, it took Georgia was not a united country. This is we're talking about not Georgia, the American state, but Georgia, the ancient kingdom, or at least the collective of kingdoms in the Caucasus. They had several princes, and it took several of them to convert one by one. It wasn't similar to perhaps how states in the United States, it would take an Orthodox majority here, an Orthodox minority there to sort of build something of essentially a foundation. Not that the foundation isn't there, but something perhaps somewhat new, at least on the New World continent. And as Jim said, there are roots, there are local saints, there are saints like Father Raphael of Brooklyn, future saint Father Seraphim Rose. There's Bishop Saint Raphael of Brooklyn, apologies, and of course future Saint Ephraim of Arizona, and many more. There's definitely a foundation. The ground is ripe for the harvest, and it's just about, I suppose, putting the good message out, and I think it will triumph over the powers of the world, and regardless of the calamities happening around the English speaking world, or what is to come in the next few decades.
Well, whenever I go to the Rocourt Cathedral in D.C. at St. John's, St. John the Baptist, there's an icon there of St. Edward, St. King Edward the Martyr, the boy king. And I always make sure to venerate that because I feel that in some sense I'm connecting with the Orthodox Anglo-Saxon roots of what later led across the sea to the birth of America. And so I sort of see him in a way as like a patriotic forebear of this country of what in its flowering it could be.
No, I'm just very pleased to have my All Saints of America icon, which the first saint being Saint Brendan the Navigator, from the
Hmm,
from the 6th century, who,
hmm.
the legend as the story says, he did make it all the way to what I guess would be called North America these days. And these sorts of the sort of connection I guess we have with those saints is very real, and even in many ways Orthodoxy is, I think, doing a better job of staying consistent with its Western roots now. I mean, I think the Orthodox tradition from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, we're like the only ones that actually venerate Alfred as a saint, King Alfred, who I'm one of my favorite historical figures and has always been interesting to me
Yeah.
even before I became Orthodox. And people make the joke all the time, the only reason California hasn't sunk into the sea is perhaps because of Platina and St. John's relics in California. But it really is true. I mean, it's it really is true that we I I don't I take these saints at their words, just like I take Metropolitan Neophytos at his word that the Turks will betray, the Russians will turn on the Turks and the Turks will turn on the Russians. I do believe that America will see at least some regard a large revival, or at least just a large growth of orthodoxy to the point where it is a formidable religious force in the country.
Well, one of the high points of my life was I was at the glorification of St. John in San Francisco, and I mean the phrase kept coming to my mind that I knew not whether I was on heaven or on earth because because of the beauty that I saw there. And what really struck me though was at one point during the glorification, they carried St. John's relics in processions around the streets, through San Francisco that had been blocked off to the occasion. And if you can believe it, there was not a single report in any local media, not on the TV news, not in the newspaper, nothing like that. And I was thinking to myself, if this had been some, Buddhist thing or something, it would have been all over the place. Oh, look at this really cute thing going on here. And in a way, I sort of felt good about it. And almost like that somehow the unseeing eyes, who has ears to hear and eyes to see, they could not see it. This is happening right under their nose in their city, and they're totally blind and deaf to it. And somehow that made me feel good. I don't know why. Maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I should have felt the opposite. But I took it more of as a sort of that we were living like in another dimension almost, separate from the Sodom and Gomorrah around us.
Yeah, and I think the procession of relics, public prayer, like we're sort of bringing it back. This is something that the world has been, cringing at for the last 100 years, thinking, well, public prayer, that's a little bit excessive. Religion needs to be a private affair. Why would you, say, have a church procession, maybe just around your property? Don't. It's very strange for them to see, and even notice how the West is, for the first time, for many, I guess, many Americans, many Europeans, for the first time, they're looking at the map of Europe and they're noticing where Ukraine is. They're like saying, okay, so there's a country named Ukraine, and there's a peninsula named Crimea, and this is the first time in their lives where they're like looking around and viewing these countries. Now, what perhaps some of these people, especially secular folks, don't understand is these traditions of huge church processions, miracle working icons, relics which stream myrrh, which smell across rooms and, entire buildings. These things are as foundational to the Ukrainian culture and nation as they are to the Russian one. So you cannot disconnect. So the Ukraine has less. It's very, in fact, true Ukrainian Christian culture, and Ukraine, I suppose, without Christianity isn't even like a cultural civilization. You can say Christianity is its foundation, which is, I think, its strength. But this whole Russian/Ukrainian Belarusian world is so grounded in Christianity that I think for many Western folks eventually, and by Western folks I don't mean this in a bad way, I mean those who perhaps are just finding out about Orthodoxy or just kind of inquiring or investigating, these Christian traditions are so foundational and they're so foreign in many ways. Like you mentioned, the St. John of Shanghai relics and of San Francisco, and they're being paraded around. No one even covers it because it's either intentionally or unintentionally. It's just completely profound and baffling. I think maybe this exposure of, I guess, Eastern Europe and what we see the Russian priests and bishops like announcing 10 days of fasting in the middle of October, which is technically, there are no fast periods in October for the Orthodox, at least not on the old calendar. So the Bishop of Kaliningrad announcing 10 days of fasting because there's a war going on, like that is just something that goes back to, I don't know, the Theotokos's intervention to save Constantinople. Like this is like an ad hoc, essentially, ad hoc prayer sessions. This is really like historical stuff, and all of these things. Maybe it's a way of, God is of course almighty and wise, and perhaps this is a way of him introducing these things, sort of showing them like, look, this is actually what reality is. These are objective things which exist. These prayers do work. This is how Christians deal with calamity and tragedy, and I guess it's just a way of displaying that true ancient Christianity back to those Western countries where it has been suppressed over centuries and decades now.
And yeah, and it's an irony, of course, because they were trying to save Constantinople from the heathen Rus, who at that time were still pagans. So, and it's interesting that it's a celebration that's much stronger among the Russians than it is among the Greeks. So it's one of those little ironies, I guess, sort of like that we Greeks and all the Orthodox celebrate the memory of the Israelite Maccabee martyrs against my heathen Greek ancestors. So it's these things happen. It's interesting when you talk about the Ukrainians too and the Ukrainian state. I mean, uh, I was talking to somebody. Of course, if you go to any Russian church anywhere in the world outside of the old country, half the Russians there are Ukrainians, in fact. And that this notion that there's a hard distinction between the two. If people who are familiar with their history know that before the revolution, Ukraine was probably the strongest hotbed of Russian patriotism because there you had the sort of mix of people, Poles and Jews and Germans and all sorts of people. So they were very conscious of their nationality in the way that people inside Great Russia maybe were less so because, well, everybody was Russian. So there were, not as much of that ethnic consciousness, but that I was talking to somebody recently. She was saying she was born in Ukraine, Russian speaking, but also learning Ukrainian in school, could speak it quite well. And she said the Ukrainian they teach now has nothing to do with the Ukrainian that they learned then. This was the sort of the far west Ukrainian language of the, of the Lvov region, which now is being imposed as the normal speech all over Ukraine, which is not necessarily what people there historically spoke at all. That, if you look at the sort of the continuum of speech, the distinctions between Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, it's sort of like in Germany between, Saxons and Bavarians and Prussians and so forth. They're all Germans. And that a lot of these distinctions were basically built up by the Bolsheviks to try to break up what had been a historically, put together community of the people of Rus who spoke different dialects and so forth to try to create something artificial and divisive. It's a very, very sad thing, and it's that's one of the things I think that Putin alluded to in one of his speeches. He said, "Well, you want to have decommunize Ukraine? We're going to help you do that because a lot of what became Ukraine became Ukraine because the Bolsheviks did it."
No, it's true, and I mean, we know Ukraine literally means borderlands, and there's been all sorts of. I mean, we're seeing now even announcements of renewed suppression of the Russian language in Ukraine from the growingly desperate Kiev regime. But Jim, you're one of the most experienced people to me from a foreign policy perspective and even a religious observer perspective on the old Orthodox world's relationship with America. And I know that you have close relationships with a lot of Serbs, and you have spent a lot of time even around associates with the Patriarch of Jerusalem and there. And even you talked about, of course, before the show, we were talking about the fall of the Soviet Union. And it seems to me that, and I think even so much so that I don't think it's just confirmation bias on my own part, that the Orthodoxy seems to always be a center of these really important flashpoints in the world when it comes to like something like a World War III or something like a collapse or renewed aggression of the global American empire. And I'm just wondering your thoughts as someone who's who's had a lot of experience in a lot of these places, and I'm sure has a lot of interesting tales and stories from some of these conflicts that we've all read about in books or heard about in on the news or on old newsreels from the 90s and stuff. How do you see that playing out from an Orthodox perspective now in 8 months into this invasion?
Well, next month, I'm going to Serbia and Bosnia, and for the first time in almost half a century, going back to Greece. So I'm looking forward to that. We'll see how that visit goes. I don't expect in Greece, especially since it's a Schengen country, and I hope there's not another stupid lockdown of some sort. I get stranded there. But whereas in Serbia, people they don't follow rules anyway, so it's I don't worry much about that.
Well,
But
regarding Serbia, there's stuff in
yeah,
Bosnia
you're right. You're
with that kind of Bosnia Republika Srpska. That's it might become a hot zone
yes.
here.
You bet. I mean, if the gay is looking for a place to push back where they feel the other camp is vulnerable, I think in fact, I need to get some more details on this, but there have been demonstrations against Milan Dodik, the president of the Republika Srpska, and I don't know what all is going on there, but clearly he's somebody who's been in the crosshairs for the gay for some time, and he may be considered a fairly vulnerable target given his location. So I'll be interested to inquire in some of that stuff when I get over there. I'll be doing a talk in Belgrade the day after the U.S. election. So hopefully we'll have something reasonable I can say at that point. But you're right. There has been this kind of like you might say pivot of history kind of thing where for a long time the Orthodox countries have been kind of in the crosshairs. Now maybe that has something to do with the fact that for most of the first, well, really for the first Christian millennium, um, when the East Roman Empire, what we refer to ridiculously as the Byzantine Empire, was kind of the center of the Christian world, and the West, which later became the Roman Catholic West and even later Protestantism, was kind of the backwater, sort of the fringe of Europe, away from the real happenings in the Middle East and in Eurasia. Well, with the decline of the empire and then its eventual conquest, that focus shifted then to the West. Historically, they became the great power, and of course, achieved their own unique cultural achievement in the High Middle Ages, and the Aristotelianism, scholasticism, and so forth, and then eventually a technological civilization. And the West the East sort of found itself between the hammer and the anvil. That we had our Western brethren on the one side, and we had primarily the forces of Islam in the Middle East, or also in the case of Russia, the Mongols. And so, in some ways, Orthodox civilization ended up in this kind of middle ground, this kind of battleground geopolitically, and that really never ended, it seems, given the way the forces of history have unfolded. And that's why it seems that these flashpoints are always there, whether they're in Bosnia or elsewhere in the Balkans, or whether in Eastern Europe, where Huntington's clash of civilization sort of takes place. And you know, there's no real security, it seems, for that Orthodox zone, with the West on the one side, formerly the Roman Catholic West, and now more the neo-pagan West, and on the other side, you have the non-Western civilizations, primarily Islam. So maybe that's just part of what we have to deal with in geopolitics and geohistory. It's just something we can't escape.
Well, and it's one of those things as well, like our biggest hot zone, the Middle East, people don't even think of it as a Christian conflict zone. They just think of Muslims and Jews. Well, it's been a Christian hot zone because they're all gone. Like they, where do you think they went, And when we talk about Syria, like the Christians were one of the strongest supporters of someone like Bashar al-Assad, because he was the only one providing the last kind of vestige of Christian stability in a formerly entirely Christian region of the world. So when it comes to that, again, I mentioned your relations perhaps with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and that what do you see? There's a they've been persecuted by the Israeli authorities in many ways through this legal kind of attack on their property in the old Holy Quarter in
Yeah.
Jerusalem. Between that, as well as renewed, calls from the Palestinian Authority, as well, even from Iran. I've heard there's been calls for a third intifada, all sorts of crazy things going on, and now Iran squarely, of course, seeming to side with Russia in the conflict. Do you see anything dramatic? Do you see that becoming another flashpoint?
I don't know if it'll become a flashpoint of the kind we've been discussing, but Patriarch Theophilus is I mean, I marvel at him. I've met him on a couple of occasions. He's a very calm man, which is surprising to me. Not only does he have the Israelis to deal with, and also some of the more radical elements are among the Palestinians. But remember, too, he's getting a lot of pressure from the State Department to
Mhm.
recognize the fake church in Ukraine, which means pressure not only from the State Department, but from Constantinople and from most of the Greek-speaking world, which is a problem for him. And somehow he seems to weather it all. I don't know how he does it. I mean, obviously there's a higher protection that he has over him than most of us ordinary mortals can claim. But and I hope that continues to be the case. I don't know that it's going to be a particular flashpoint of the type that we're discussing, though. I think he's going to just have to keep going and doing what he's doing, even though he's surrounded by alligators.
Yeah, and I think just for listeners who aren't aware, Patriarch Theophilus, he is the leader of the Orthodox Christians in Israel, as well as Jordan and some of the surrounding regions. So his flock isn't too large. It's about I believe it's under a million, if not maybe half a million Orthodox Christians. And Patriarch Theophilus, along with the Patriarch of Antioch, are the only two last Greek essentially great leaders of the Greek local churches who haven't actually openly either supported Zelensky or supported the Ukrainian schismatic church, which proclaims itself Orthodox, but which has, essentially being all but this golem, this creation of, I suppose, foreign anti-Christian powers
Yeah.
in the Ukraine. So Patriarch Theophilus has a lot of pressure on him, not just, and of course, all the previous patriarchs of Jerusalem have, especially in the last 100 years, even regarding to property rights, real estate. There's always tension around who owns what piece of land, what document do you use to back it up, who pays what taxes, what levies. There's all kinds of, I suppose you could say, legal matters in the land of Israel, which
Yeah.
are always pending from what I hear. There's always lawsuits going on. There's always, and of course, the church has to pay all of these things out of its coffers. And it's not a rich church, mind you. It's a church full of Greeks, of course, local Orthodox Palestinians, and it's mainly funded through pilgrims. So essentially, whenever you go on a pilgrimage to Israel and you visit the holy sites, anytime you donate money, it helps to sustain the Orthodox Christians there, as well as some of the church communities. It's very much a sort of like the holy fire. It burns bright and it doesn't burn, but again, it's not that large. It's humble, but it's beautiful in that sense. So we have these two Greek patriarchs in the Middle East who continue to stand on this very conservative, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, stance on the Ukrainian issue. They haven't exactly called in favor of the special military operation, but instead they've, as foreigners and as non-Russians, as simply Orthodox leaders, they've called for peace and, of course, peace talks in regards to both the war and in regards to any church scandals and schisms. And unfortunately, their voices are, ignored by many other leaders in the Orthodox international community, as opposed to being heard. So there's a lot of admiration for Patriarch Theophilus, and he's a great man. Hopefully, his health is
Right.
sustained. Yep.
And the other thing, by the way, I mentioned with regarding the Jerusalem Patriarchate is there also has been a substantial increase in the number of Russian speakers in the flock because when Jews left the Soviet Union and Russia and Ukraine and other countries and came to the Middle East, some of the people that came with, well, first off, some of them were also Orthodox Christians, even from Jewish ethnicity. Others were relatives, or left to go to Israel even though they weren't Jewish. And so you do have a number of Russian-speaking Orthodox Christians now in the Patriarch's flock. The other one we should mention, though, is that Anastasios, the Archbishop of Albania, also has not jumped on this fake church approval in Ukraine. And even within Greece, Cyprus, and the Alexandria Patriarchate, even though the primates of those churches have recognized the phony church, a lot of their bishops have not. And as far as I know, they, at least in Cyprus, it was not a synodal decision, and I don't think it was in Alexandria either. I could be wrong about that, but that's why I think the Russians, even with respect to those churches, have taken more of a diocese by diocese, bishop by bishop approach rather than the church as a whole, the way they have with Constantinople.
No, and in many ways, we've talked about, I mentioned earlier, the new crew coming to right the ship, and who is, almost, I think it's the majority of actual bishops in Cyprus haven't recognized the Ukrainians, but like you said, the archbishop, the patriarch has, and he's, again, not trying to rejoice in anybody's death, but he is aging. He's very old. People don't think there's already been a lot of, talk and preparation for their bizarre kind of election patriarchal system that they have there. In many ways, even the Patriarch of Georgia, who has stood strongly, but he's getting old, and we have had
Mm-hmm.
the Patriarch of Serbia is new. I've mentioned this on the podcast before. All of this turnover, and then of course we have in America, we have new Metropolitan of Rokor. We're about to get, of course, eventually a new Metropolitan of Antioch. All of this is happening, and the hope is that eventually we can get something like a pan-Orthodox council. And as we talked about before, as Jim said, we need these people in the civil realm because that's been so important through history. Because who called ecumenical councils in the past but the emperor, not the pope, not random priests, but it was the emperor that called these councils. And we may not have an emperor now, but perhaps returning to a more normal world, we could perhaps get a council and resolve some of these issues, most notably the schism in Ukraine, but even other issues like the calendar and some of these other things.
I hear you, and I share that optimism. I also worry about it. We all remember the phony, uh, maybe I should say phony. Let's say the failed attempt to hold a council in Crete in 2016. And anytime I hear the word council, I also worry that there are people in the Orthodox world who would like to have our version of Vatican II. And sometimes I think we're better off without a council. Maybe the era of councils has passed, just like the era of writing scriptures has passed. I'm not saying that as a positive assertion. We have had, over the centuries since then, various kinds of statements from Orthodox patriarchs. But in the disordered state of our church right now, with the lack of guidance from godly secular rulers, maybe a council wouldn't be such a great idea. As far as Putin, you mentioned, you have seen the video some years ago when he went to Mount Athos, and the Greek monks put him in the throne there that belonged to the Roman emperor. They never put the president of Greece in there. So I really do wonder sometimes. I mean, maybe if the I don't know. I think that's probably overstating it. I don't know that we have an emperor lurking around that we just don't happen to know, but who knows how God reveals his will.
No, I agree. Unless people assume I'm naive, I don't necessarily have a big prediction of when or how that would happen. It would entirely happen out of the very miraculous grace of God. But we talked about Patriarch Theophilos, who did try to call an ecumenical council to resolve it, and basically everyone signed up except, of course, the one guy you needed to come, Patriarch Bartholomew. So that's kind of the miracle that we
You
may or may
mean
not need to happen. But
Kirill?
no, Patriarch Bartholomew didn't want to come to the Patriarch of Jerusalem's. No, I'm talking about the one that the Patriarch of
Oh, I
Jerusalem
see.
tried
I'm
to
sorry.
call.
I thought you were referring to Crete when
Oh no, yeah.
Kirill wouldn't
Oh
come.
yeah.
Yes, I
Well,
see. Right.
well, thank
Yes,
goodness.
yes.
And
All right, right.
The
Yeah.
Antiochians didn't show up either. Thank the Lord. I'm proud to be a member of the Antiochian
And I
Church
think
because of
the
it.
Bulgarians didn't show up, right?
Yep. And
Yeah.
I don't know about
And
the
I think
Georgians either.
also what Georgians either, yeah.
But I was going to say I agree with you that there are worries because we just saw the latest quote unquote ecumenical council, which hopefully will be tossed into the bin of history and perhaps just known as something of a pseudo robber council in the future. The In the same question, we hear a lot of discourse on Twitter about unity in the American Orthodox Church. And we know eventually we all would love to see a united Orthodox synod, but in some cases, people believe that perhaps we don't because of how easy something like that would be to be subverted by the very GAE, the gay that we've been talking about this whole time. So I'm a bit curious to perhaps your thoughts on that as well.
I tend to agree with you. Father Josiah Trenum, whom I respect very much, was one of the speakers at the conference at the Antiochian Village recently, and he has a very excellent video on unity in the Orthodox Church in America. And he calls it a scandal that you're not united. And in principle, I agree with them. But I'm just trying to think of a pathway to any kind of unity that wouldn't be a disaster. I mean, we can trust that the Holy Spirit would achieve such unity in a way that suited God's purpose, not political agendas of various actors, including, as you say, the woke authorities in this country. But I mean, would you want to see unity in America under the Greek Archdiocese? I certainly would not. And frankly, as much as there are many good people in the OCA, I wouldn't want to see it under the OCA either. And so I don't really know how we could have unity in this country under anything, in terms of anything we see now. Maybe at some point that would be appropriate, and in the future, hopefully not too distant future, that could occur. But maybe in some ways, our disunity kind of insulates us from some of these agendas. I mean, you've heard the expression that the reason the devil can't subvert the Orthodox Church is he can't figure out the organization chart. Um, the same kind of compartmentalization structurally, but not spiritually, but structurally, that maybe insulates us from some of the winds of the age, maybe also protect us to some extent here in America.
Yeah, I think Jim makes an interesting point that the sort of not disunity, but essentially the compartmentalization of orthodoxy among the North American states has prevented certain agencies, whether it be the CIA, FBI, or anything even more subversive, from infiltrating and taking over the hierarchies of certain church bodies, such as what we've heard about from some of our Catholic colleagues that they believe is happening in the Catholic Church from the top up, top down from the Vatican, and also among some of the more liberal dioceses in the Catholic Church. But it's definitely, I think I heard this take, Jim. I'm not sure who first kind of put it out there, but I believe I heard Jay Dyer mention it about 3 years ago in 2019 on one of his like an FAQ he had, where he mentions, well, the unity of Orthodoxy in America would be great as a long-term project, but at the moment it seems that it is almost a providential, and by unity I mean jurisdictionally, it's almost a providential kind of arrangement that, well, there are these jurisdictions, some of them may falter in certain questions, but others rise up and are kind of insulated from that. So, as you mentioned, it's actually a very unique sort of case historically. I don't think we've ever seen anything like it. Just before I let you go, Jim, one more thing, and we see a different sort of occurrence, I suppose, and this is maybe unfortunately in Russian history. When the Patriarchate was reestablished, it was reestablished right on the precipice of the revolution. So what we have is Patriarch, of course, Tikhon, the saint and martyr, and after him, and even Patriarch Tikhon, if you read his last few years, it was absolutely, he was under incredible pressure from the new USSR/Bolshevik state, which was just pounding him with, like, they were forcing him to make statements, forcing him to make concessions, etc., etc. Like, it is just incredible. And the next few patriarchs, all the way up to Alexius II, which a lot of people, there's of course the talks of Sergianism and things of that nature, but these scandals are in the past now. Despite that, the patriarchs of Moscow were under such immense pressure simply because they were actually personified symbols, not symbols, but they were actually the figurehead leaders of that administration of the USSR local church jurisdiction. So the fact that it was a one leadership, one man who you could actually approach, one man you could speak to, one man you can make arrangements with, made that whole essentially unsuccessful in the end, because we had so many great saints from the USSR, like Saint Matrona of Moscow, Saint Seraphim of Vyritsa, Saint Lawrence of Chernigov. I can go on and on, and it's incredible that that particular issue in Russian history, and it was probably similar to the Greeks and Orthodox folks in Turkey under the Ottoman rule, when you can make deals, when you can pressure the patriarch as a single figurehead, or pressure the council around him, then you would have immediate impact upon the jurisdiction. In America, that isn't really a possibility because you have multiple synods, multiple leaders, and of course there hasn't been, I think, a force on this planet as culturally subversive and as influential as what we would call today the global American empire, this corrupt vision of what America should be, and kind of puts out. I think that's also noteworthy to kind of like a decent mention.
You're exactly right about that. You're right about that. As Father Josiah pointed out, in Orthodox unity, it's not so much union as reunion. As once upon a time, Orthodoxy, obviously before the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Americas were the missionary territory of the Russian Patriarchate, we did have united jurisdiction here with Greeks and Arabs and all sorts of other people in it. It wasn't always smooth running, but it did exist. So that's what you're trying to achieve again. But that also shows back to the whole secular authority thing, is that without an emperor, an Orthodox emperor or an Orthodox political authority, how do you achieve that church unity? Why after centuries of serfdom to the Ottomans, how is it that Constantinople suddenly went haywire under Meletios Metaxakis with the collapse of the Russian Empire as well? Because during the latter years of the Russian Empire, it was the protecting force of the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire as well, which I think also kept the Ecumenical Patriarchate from going too far in any kind of negative direction. But as soon as that was removed, then suddenly they became playthings of the British, or now probably of the CIA as well. So it's the lack of that, you might say, secular gyroscope to keep the church on track with a godly secular ruler is what I think helps to promote a healthy church unity, and that's what you don't see on the scene in America today. Is that where is that ethnarch or ethnic leadership or political leadership of a godly nature that can ensure that an American church would be what it is supposed to be, rather than just sort of drifting up in all these directions. And I think the proof in the pudding there is, look at the poor Roman Catholics with the current pope they have. If Archbishop Vigano where their pope, you could say a lot of things about perhaps their top-down structure, but when they have the kind of guy they have there now, and you see all these traditional Catholics saying, "Oh, Vatican II, Vatican II, Vatican II," the problem isn't Vatican II; it's Vatican I. The one guy in charge of everything, and you must shut up and obey. And what do you say to that? Thank goodness we don't have that kind of structure.
No, for real. Thank goodness. But, thank goodness that they have that structure and that the Pope is so well respected, because here at World War now, we can just default to him, because who else agrees that we're in the Third World War? Pope Francis. He said it himself, and which I think is very funny. But
So it must
but
be true.
it must be true. Sorry, yeah. Any Catholic that tries to argue with me about
Well, I
geopolitics,
actually,
it's over for
I
you.
think, I think, I think Archbishop Vigano would actually agree with him on that. That's probably the only thing they would agree on.
Oh yeah. No, I think we'll have to have a bigger episode on some of the implications of some of the Fatima stuff and Pope Francis and the Vatican's conspiratorial. Maybe we'll talk to Jay Dyer about that actually. But I think we're getting close to well over an hour and a half here. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think we've covered more than all the bases we cover and like to talk about here on World War Now. Fantastic first interview. I don't think it could have gone better. But Jim, I want to give you the chance to wrap it up. Let the people know anything that you think needs to be known about the current geopolitical, geospiritual situation, and also let people know where they can find you, follow you for all the work that you put out.
Well, I don't really have too much to add. I think we pretty much covered it all. Where they find me is primarily on Twitter, that at Jim Jatras. Against my better judgment, I'm pretty active on that. I realize there are drawbacks to any kind of social media and any kind of public profile like this. And if I were smart, I would just devote myself to my property, my chickens, and all that kind of stuff, and just try to shut the rest of the world out, go full Unabomber in the woods in a cabin. But I'm not doing that. And and as far as I've got a number of writings. If you want, I can I send you the links to post to my writings on strategic culture and Chronicles magazine and a few other places. In fact, I've been toying with the idea of pulling those together into a book, like an anthology of my past writings, but if that's worthwhile. But other than that, no, I don't have too much to add. I just really want to thank you, gentlemen. Conrad, you there in the Free Republic of Texas, and Dimitri over there in down under. And other than that, I thank you both for the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We hope to have you on again in the future. We hope there's multiple episodes of Jim joining us. And if you ever get the itch to write something that you think's in our wheelhouse, we would love to put it up on our Substack. So, keep in touch with us on that. But with all of that being said, Dimitri, maybe let us know where you can find us everywhere, and we'll land that plane and have everyone a good evening.
Yeah, again, I just want to thank the eloquent and illustrious Jim Jatras for gracing us with his presence and, of course, giving the absolutely insightful and relevant takes to today's geopolitical slash ecclesiological circumstances around the world. I think it's as timely as ever, and it was an absolute pleasure to have him on, and I'm sure the listeners have also appreciated it or will appreciate upon listening. Now, you can follow World War Now. Primarily, I recommend the Substack, which is World War Now. Just Google the Substack. You can subscribe there and give us a follow. There are articles there. There's more articles being published every week, so the content is up to date. It's very relevant to the current circumstances around the world. The other place you could follow us would, of course, be World War Now on YouTube. For more explicit and perhaps unfiltered opinions, you can check out World War Now on Telegram. And, of course, you can follow myself and Conrad on Twitter. So at World War Now _ on Twitter, at OCanonist, which is myself, Dmitry Kalyagin, on Twitter, and, of course, at GnomeRad for Conrad's Twitter handle, and of course at Jim Jatras for all the best opinions on most matters. We of course appreciate his presence, and fortunately it was an absolutely fruitful and insightful stream, not just to myself, but hopefully for the listeners as well.
Everyone have a good night. God bless.
Right.
God bless.